Montana Territory, late October 1883. In a narrow, wind-scoured valley, 12 miles south of what would eventually become the city of Helena, a structure began to rise from the frozen dirt that made every experienced frontier builder stop their wagons and stare in sheer disbelief. While every single homesteader in Flathead County was frantically felling lodgepole pine, squaring corners, and dragging sawed logs to build traditional rectangular cabins, one man was doing something that seemed like total madness. He was gathering smooth, water-worn river stones from a freezing creek bed and stacking them into a perfect, seamless circle. The locals watched his progress with amusement at first, then with growing concern for his family, and finally with outright mockery. The seasoned carpenters of the valley swore on their lives that the roof would cave in under the very first winter snowfall, that the walls would crack open, and that the wind sweeping off the northern Rockies would turn the inside of that bizarre stone ring into a deep-freeze tomb. What those seasoned builders failed to understand was that this round building would fundamentally challenge 200 years of frontier construction wisdom. The real question was never whether his circular stone shelter would stand up to the blizzard. The real question was whether anyone else's home would look livable once the Arctic hammer fell across Montana. By mid-December, when an unstoppable mass of Canadian polar air dropped the outdoor temperature to 18 degrees below zero Fahrenheit and held it there for 3 straight weeks, that circular stone building became the single most talked about structure in the entire territory. Not because it collapsed under the snow load, but because it didn't even flinch. While families in square timber homes huddled shivering around red-hot stoves, burning through their entire winter firewood supply at a desperate, terrifying rate, the round cabin maintained an interior temperature that seemed physically impossible for the tiny amount of fuel being burned. The locals called it a stroke of pure luck at first. Then they called it stubborn Scottish hard-headedness. But when the formal measurements were taken, and the mercury and calibrated thermometers laid out the facts, they called it something else entirely. They called it the future of frontier survival. Now, picture this. This isn't a fairy tale about some legendary miracle worker or a secret magic trick lost to time. This is the true story of one practical stonemason who ignored unquestioned traditions, listened to basic physics, and built a continuous thermal engine out of river stone and dirt. Before we step into the heart of this relentless storm and dissect the exact engineering that broke every rule in the West, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what the coldest winter temperature you have ever survived in your corner of the world is. I read every single one of your stories. To understand why a round stone cabin seemed like suicide to the homesteaders of 1883, you have to understand the brutal realities of a Northern Territory winter. In late 19th century Montana, shelter wasn't about architectural style or aesthetic comfort. Shelter was a high-stakes duel between human biology and thermal radiation. Samuel Hendricks arrived in the Montana Territory in the spring of 1883, alongside his wife Catherine and their 2 young daughters. Samuel had spent 15 hard years working as a journeyman stonemason in the cold gray drizzle of Aberdeen, Scotland. He was not an academic theorist. He was not trying to make a bold public statement. He was simply a man with deeply calloused hands, a calm demeanor, and an unshakable understanding of how heavy materials store and release energy over time. By late September, Samuel had cleared 3 acres of wild ground, planted his winter crop, and turned his attention to housing. The surrounding hillsides were packed dense with thick stands of lodgepole pine. It was the standard building material of the American frontier. It was cheap, abundant, and easy to cut with a crosscut saw. But pine logs shrink as they dry out. They twist, they warp, and they leave giant seams at every corner joint that must be stuffed with mud, straw, and horsehair year after year. Samuel knew wood, but he truly understood stone. He knew how dense rock absorbed heat, how it held that energy deep within its core, and how it slowly radiated that warmth back into a cold room long after the embers died out. And running right through his land claim was a wide creek bed crammed with an endless free supply of smooth granite and limestone river stones. They had been tumble-polished by centuries of alpine runoff, already shaped and sorted by nature itself. His original pencil sketch was traditional enough. A rectangular cottage measuring 16 feet wide by 20 feet long, sitting on a stone foundation with squared log walls stretching upward. But as Samuel began hauling heavy rocks out of the creek bed, a massive practical problem slapped him in the face. The river rocks were medium-sized, rounded boulders. They had no flat surfaces, no 90-degree edges, and no sharp corners. To build 4 sharp, square corners for a rectangular stone foundation, he would have to spend weeks, taking a hammer and chisel to every single boulder, splitting them apart, wasting half the raw rock, and destroying their natural structural integrity just to make them fit an arbitrary square box. And then there was the wind. The wind in that Montana valley never truly stopped. It swept down from the high mountain peaks every morning, whipped through the open brush during the day, and slammed into the scattered homesteads like a freight train at night. Samuel spent his evenings watching his neighbors build their cabins. He noticed how the screaming winter winds slammed straight into the flat outer walls of square cabins, creating massive high-pressure zones on the windward face and vacuum pockets on the leeward sides. That extreme pressure differential ripped right through the chinking mud, sucking freezing draft air directly through the corner joints where the timber logs intersected. No matter how much mud or rag insulation his neighbors jammed into those corner seams, the wind always found a way inside. The right angles of a square house act as heat traps in reverse. They gather cold, pull wind, and drain thermal energy from the interior. One cool evening in early October, Catherine walked outside and found Samuel down on his knees, drawing shapes in the damp dirt with a stripped pine stick. He hadn't drawn a square house with 4 crisp corners. He had drawn a large, perfect circle. Samuel looked up at his wife and told her quietly that the creek stones were already round, and the wind couldn't bite onto a curve the way it bites onto a sharp corner. Catherine looked at the circle in the soil, looked at her husband, and reminded him that no homesteading family in the entire county lived in a round stone beehive. She warned him that the neighbors would say they had lost their minds. Samuel nodded and said he knew that too. But winter did not care about human opinions, and frostbite did not care about architectural tradition. With November rapidly approaching on the calendar, Samuel made up his mind. He would follow the physical properties of the stone, eliminate every corner joint entirely, assemble his circular walls before the first major snowfall hit, and let the brutal Montana climate serve as the ultimate judge of who was right. Here's what everyone missed about the physics of a traditional log cabin back then. In a 16 by 20-foot rectangular home, you might have 320 gross square feet of floor space on paper. But in reality, you lose at least 60 square feet of that space to unusable dead-air corner pockets. In every square cabin built across the West, those 4 corners were perpetually freezing cold. Because heat moves in continuous, expanding radiant waves, a square stove or fireplace sitting against one straight wall radiates its heat outward in a semicircle. That radiant heat slams into the flat wall opposite the fire, while the far corners sit completely outside the direct radiant pathway. Cold air pools in those dark corners, drops down to the floor, and creates continuous internal draft currents as the cold air sinks and warm air rises to the roof peak. Families tried to fight this convective heat loss by hanging heavy wool blankets to partition off their square rooms. But that only made the thermodynamics worse. It blocked radiant airflow, locked cold air inside the cut-off corners, and forced the cabin occupants to burn twice as much wood just to keep the central living area barely above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Samuel sat down on an oak stump with a piece of slate and did the thermal math the way stonemasons were trained to do in northern Britain. An 18-foot diameter circular cabin would give his family approximately 254 square feet of continuous interior space. While that total surface area sounded slightly smaller than a standard 16 by 20 cabin, every single square inch of a round room is active, livable space. There were no dead air corners, no dark alcoves where cold air could settle undisturbed. And most importantly, a central heat source placed at the absolute center of an 18-foot circle would sit at an exact, equal distance of 9 feet from every single point along the perimeter wall. The radiant energy from a single central fire would travel outward in 360 degrees, hitting the inner curve of the stone walls uniformly, warming the entire floor envelope simultaneously, and creating a perfectly balanced thermal zone without a single cold spot. The math favored the circle, the geometry favored the rock, and the thermodynamics favored survival. On the morning of October 8th, 1883, Samuel drove a heavy iron stake deep into the dirt at the center of his building site. He tied a 9-foot length of heavy hemp rope to the stake, walked out to the end of the line, and swept a broad arc around the center point, scoring a perfect 18-foot diameter ring into the earth. He dug a trench 2 feet wide and 30 inches deep into the ground, clearing away the topsoil until he hit dense, unyielding gravel subsoil well below the frost line. This deep excavation wasn't just to anchor the foundation against ground heave. It was the first critical layer of his thermal design. By sinking the stone footings 30 inches into the native earth, he was linking the base of his structure directly to the stable temperature of the ground below, shielding the floor slab from the freezing ambient air outside. Then he started laying the river stones. Because there were no 45 or 90-degree corner joints to cut, dress, or square up, his building speed was incredible. Each rounded granite boulder found its natural resting place in the gentle curve of the circular wall. Samuel picked up each stone, evaluated its weight and contour, and set it into a deep bedding of hydraulic mortar he mixed by hand using slaked lime, fine river sand, and crushed limestone dug from a natural outcrop a mile up the valley. The mortar didn't just glue the rocks together. It sealed every micro-fissure, transforming thousands of loose river stones into a single, seamless monolith. The walls rose at a massive thickness of 24 inches, 2 full feet of solid stone and dense mortar. To the passing neighbors, building a 2-foot-thick stone wall for a small homestead shelter looked like absolute insanity. It required moving tens of thousands of pounds of raw material by hand, using a wooden wheelbarrow and raw muscle. But Samuel was not building a decorative wall. He was building a massive thermal battery. He deliberately layered the masonry to maximize thermal absorption. He placed dark, dense river granite along the interior face of the wall. Dark granite has a high thermal capacity, allowing it to soak up radiant heat rapidly from the interior living space. On the outer face of the wall, he laid lighter, porous limestone rocks that acted as a natural weather shield against wind-driven moisture and freezing rain. As the circular walls crept upward, Samuel angled the stones with a very subtle inward taper, giving the structure a gentle conical rise. This subtle inward batter used gravity to push the mass of the wall inward toward the center, creating continuous structural compression. In stone masonry, compression is ultimate strength. The circular shape turned the entire wall into a continuous arch. There were no weak structural seams, no joinery points to strain under stress, and no straight surfaces that could be bowed inward by the tremendous force of high mountain windstorms. Right at the precise physical center of the 18-foot circle, Samuel laid the masonry foundation for his fireplace and chimney. In every conventional log home constructed across the American frontier, the stone fireplace was pushed flush against an exterior wall or shoved into a far corner to keep it out of the main walking path. Think about that for a second, because that common placement was a catastrophic thermal mistake. When a fireplace is built into an outside wall, over half of its radiant heat passes directly through the rear masonry bricks and escapes straight into the freezing outdoor wilderness. You end up spending half your wood supply heating the cold sky outside your house. Samuel built his stone hearth dead center. The hearth sat directly on the ground, anchored to the gravel subsoil. Rising straight up from the floor was a square masonry firebox, built from heavy river granite and lined with dense mountain clay. And beneath the hearth floor, Samuel installed a crucial safety detail that most amateur builders ignored: a dedicated fresh air intake flue. He laid a 4-inch clay pipe running underground from the southern exterior wall directly into the base of the central firebox. This subfloor intake pipe drew fresh outdoor oxygen straight into the base of the fire, feeding the combustion cycle naturally without drawing cold air drafts across the cabin floor. More importantly, this dedicated air intake, paired with a straight vertical stone chimney rising straight out through the roof apex, guaranteed that toxic combustion gases like carbon monoxide were swept cleanly up and out of the cabin. In an airtight, thick-walled stone structure, proper ventilation is a life-or-death engineering requirement. Without a dedicated fresh air supply and a clean exhaust draft, a sealed fire will consume the oxygen inside the living space and flood the room with deadly carbon monoxide. Samuel's design ensured continuous positive airflow, pulling fresh air into the hearth while venting every trace of dangerous gas straight up into the atmosphere. Because the firebox sat in the middle of the room, every single thermal unit of heat radiated outward in 360 degrees. Not a single calorie of energy was lost to the outdoor wind. The heat hit the inner stone walls, wrapped around the continuous circular envelope, and turned the entire room into a balanced thermal chamber. For the roof, Samuel bypassed the massive, heavy timber ridge beams used in peaked cabin designs. Instead, he utilized an ancient Scottish structural technique that relied on radial tension and compressive geometry. He crafted short, thick pine rafters that met at a central wooden collar ring, hovering directly over the central chimney, resembling the spokes on a heavy wagon wheel. The lower ends of the rafters rested firmly on top of the 2-foot-thick stone wall, anchored into a continuous circular timber plate. Over these radial rafters, he nailed hand-split cedar shakes in a steep conical pattern. The cone shape created a massive structural advantage over traditional peaked gables. When heavy mountain blizzards slammed into a standard gable roof, snow accumulated heavily on the flat, sloping plains, creating asymmetric weight loads that could easily crush rafters or blow gables inward. A conical roof, however, split the wind in every direction. No matter which way the gale slammed down from the mountains, the wind slid smoothly around the circular curve of the roof without finding a flat surface to grab onto or lift. And the steep slope of the cone caused heavy snow to slide off continuously, shedding weight before ice dams could ever form. Inside the cabin, running around the entire perimeter wall, Samuel built a continuous stone bench. It stood 18 inches high off the floor and 16 inches deep, mortared directly into the interface of the circular masonry. To his neighbors, this bench looked like simple, crude seating, but Samuel built it as an auxiliary thermal bank. Sitting low to the floor, this massive ring of solid stone absorbed the gentle, radiant warmth of the central hearth all day long. When the fire died down to low embers in the deep dark hours of the midnight freeze, that 18-inch stone ledge released its stored energy at floor level, preventing cold air from settling where his children slept. By November 3, 1883, the circular cabin was fully enclosed. Catherine hung thick wool curtains over the 2 small southern-facing windows. Samuel stacked 8 cords of bone-dry pine firewood outside in a neat, circular ring around the shelter. From the outside, the building looked like nothing the valley had ever seen. It rose up from the brown prairie earth like a massive stone kiln, a low, rounded fortress of river rock, topped with a sharp cone of dark cedar shingles. The local community was not impressed. James Wolford, a veteran carpenter who had constructed 17 traditional log cabins across the Montana Territory, stopped by the property in late October to deliver his final, unvarnished verdict. Wolford stood near the stone wall with his heavy winter coat buttoned tight, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Samuel smooth mortar over the final tier of river rocks. He shook his head, tapped his heavy boot against the curved masonry, and asked Samuel where his corner posts were. Samuel wiped his mortar trowel on a damp rag and answered quietly that he didn't need corner posts because there were no corners. Wolford scoffed and told him that every sound structure in the West needed corners. Corners were where timber tied together, where strength was anchored, and where walls bracing against gales found their leverage. Samuel laid his palm flat against the cool, damp river rock and told him that stone did not need corners. Stone needed compression, and the curve provided continuous, unbreakable structural tension around the entire perimeter. Wolford shook his head again and pointed up at the conical rafters meeting at the central chimney ring. He told Samuel that the moment a heavy mountain snow fell in February, those short rafters would lose their balance, slide outward, and collapse the entire roof inward like a deck of cards. He warned Samuel not to come begging for help, when his strange stone beehive crushed his family in their sleep. The conversation swept through the settlement like a grass fire. Within 48 hours, Samuel's round stone cabin was the primary joke at every dinner table, general store counter, and church gathering in the area. Margaret Fletcher, whose family occupied the neighboring homestead, confronted Catherine directly in town while buying lard and flour. She told Catherine plainly that her husband was gambling with his children's lives just to prove a point, and that a proper Christian family belonged inside a proper square house with real rooms, not a circular stone silo built for grain storage. Even Reverend Pierce, the circuit-riding preacher who rode through the valley once a month, offered his gentle concern. He reminded Samuel that the scriptures spoke of the four corners of the earth and the square foundations of ancient temples, hinting that deviating from traditional human geometry was bordering on spiritual vanity. Samuel listened to everyone with quiet respect, but as a Scottish mason, he knew something those frontiersmen had forgotten. God made river rocks round, mountain peaks domed, and wind currents circular. Nature rarely built in 90-degree right angles, and nature was the only force that mattered when the temperature dropped below zero. Stay with me here, because what happened next is where pure physical reality tore through human opinion and proved the numbers beyond any shadow of a doubt. To understand why Samuel's design worked so brilliantly, you have to break down the exact thermodynamics of thermal mass versus thermal insulation. A traditional log cabin, built from 12-inch chinked logs, provides a minor degree of wood insulation, but it possesses almost zero thermal storage mass. Wood is light, porous, and full of microcellular air pockets. When a fire burns hot inside a log cabin, the air warms up rapidly, but the thin wood walls cannot hold onto that energy. The moment the fire burns down, heat passes straight through the wood fibers and escapes into the surrounding cold air. A log cabin cools down almost as fast as a tent. You are forced to keep a roaring fire going every single hour of the day and night just to stay warm. Samuel's 2-foot-thick riverstone walls created a completely different thermal phenomenon. The total weight of stone in his circular wall equaled approximately 47,000 pounds of dense masonry. That is nearly 24 tons of raw granite and limestone wrapped around a 254-square-foot room. Think about that for a second. 47,000 pounds of rock equals roughly 4,200 pounds of solid thermal mass for every single linear foot of wall. When a stone wall that massive is exposed to interior radiant heat, it acts exactly like a giant sponge absorbing water. The stone absorbs heat energy slowly over a period of many days. Once those 24 tons of rock reach a saturated thermal state of around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, they hold on to that energy with unbelievable tenacity. The outer face of the stone wall, cold and dense, creates a thermal barrier. Heat inside the room cannot travel quickly through 2 feet of solid granite to escape outside. Instead, the inner face of the stone wall stays warm, constantly reflecting thermal energy back into the center of the living space. This creates what mechanical engineers call thermal inertia. Even if the central fire goes completely out for 12 hours, those 24 tons of warm stone continue to radiate heat inward, keeping the air temperature stable, comfortable, and completely protected from outdoor fluctuations. And then there was the aerodynamic physics of the circular envelope. When a heavy 30-mile-per-hour Arctic wind gust hits a flat, square log cabin wall, the air strikes a hard vertical barrier. The wind energy halts abruptly, builds up immense pneumatic pressure against the flat wall, and forces its way through every tiny microscopic crack in the mortar, window frames, and corner joints. Furthermore, as that gale rushes past the sharp 90-degree corners of a square house, it creates violent air eddies and low-pressure vacuums along the side walls. That vacuum actively sucks warm air out through the chinking seams of the building, creating an aggressive convective heat siphon. When that same 30-mile-per-hour Arctic gale strikes a round stone cabin, the wind finds zero flat resistance. The airstream hits the curved surface, splits smoothly, and wraps harmlessly around the circular walls without creating a high-pressure impact zone. The wind slides off the rounded masonry, exact as water slides off a river boulder. Without high-pressure zones or corner vacuums, the external wind cannot push cold air into the cabin, nor can it siphon warm air out. The circular geometry neutralizes the wind before the gale can ever steal a single degree of internal heat. And inside the shelter, the geometry was even more effective. In a traditional square room with a corner fireplace, warm air rises straight to the peak of the ceiling, travels across the flat roof rafters, strikes the upper cold corners, drops rapidly down the freezing outer walls, and crawls back along the floor toward the hearth. This creates continuous, uncomfortable cold drafts at floor level where people sit, sleep, and walk. In Samuel's round cabin, the central hearth created a clean toroidal convection loop. Warm air rose straight up from the central fire toward the conical roof apex. Because the roof was a smooth, uninterrupted cone, the rising warm air did not pool in cold ceiling corners. Instead, the warm air rolled gently down the sloping conical rafters, touched the top of the warm stone walls, cascaded smoothly around the circular curve of the room, and washed gently down to the stone bench at floor level, before being pulled back into the central hearth intake. It was a perfectly self-contained, self-regulating thermodynamic cycle. There were no dead corners to trap cold air, no sudden drafts caused by pressure differentials, and no wasted energy trapped in an unused attic space. The system maintained absolute thermal equilibrium. The numbers don't lie, and by early December of 1883, those physical principles were put to the ultimate survival test. The first modest cold wave arrived on December 11th, 1883. The outdoor temperature dropped down to 6 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. It was a firm reminder of what was coming, but hardly a severe crisis. Samuel kept a small, steady fire burning in his central hearth. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the interior of the round stone cabin measured a comfortable, stable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Catherine baked fresh loaves of bread in the hearth coals without needing a shawl around her shoulders. Their 2 young daughters played happily on the wooden floorboards, barefoot and wearing single-layer cotton dresses. When Samuel stepped outside to haul another armload of wood, he looked across the snow-dusted valley and noticed thick plumes of dark smoke billowing frantically from every log cabin chimney in the area. His neighbors were burning their wood fires hard, feeding their stoves continuously in a desperate attempt to push back against the early chill. Samuel did some quick mental math. At their current rate of fuel consumption, most families in the valley would run completely out of firewood by early February. He had 8 cords stacked outside. At his current low burn rate, he would consume barely 4 cords before spring arrived. Christmas came and went with mild, manageable weather. The temperature hovered near 30 degrees on some afternoon slopes, dropping down to 0 on others. Samuel's central fire burned low, silent, and steady. The thick stone walls had already reached thermal saturation. They held on to that heat during the day and breathed it back into the living space throughout the dark night. Then January hit with the force of an Arctic sledgehammer. On January 3rd, 1884, a massive wave of Canadian polar air surged down from the Yukon and dropped over the Montana Territory like a thick sheet of solid lead. The outdoor temperature plummeted past 0 in a matter of hours. It dropped to 12 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, then 15 below, then 18 below. And then the weather froze completely solid. For 3 straight weeks, the outdoor thermometer never rose above 0. Most days, the ambient temperature hovered continuously between 10 below 0 and 20 below 0. And then came the screaming mountain winds. Sustained gales of 30 to 40 miles per hour lashed across the open valley, dragging the wind chill down to a terrifying 40 degrees below 0. Exposed human skin froze solid in less than 5 minutes. Livestock collapsed and froze inside unheated timber barns. Heavy snow piled 4 feet deep across the prairie, with wind-driven snowdrifts stacking 7 feet high against the northern walls of every building in the settlement. The valley went into emergency survival mode. Families abandoned their multi-room floor plans and moved their entire households into single, small rooms, boarding up interior doors and surrendering the rest of their homes to the ice. They burned wooden chairs, fence posts, and spare furniture when their dry firewood ran dangerously low. Men organized emergency timber-cutting parties into the deep forest, risking severe frostbite and frost-cracked axes just to keep their families alive for another 24 hours. Every square cabin in the valley became a desperate, exhausting battleground against convective cold. Feed the fire, stuff the corner seams with old rags, pile every wool blanket over shivering children, and pray for a shift in the wind. On the morning of January 8th, James Wolford, the veteran carpenter who had confidently predicted that Samuel's roof would collapse, reached his breaking point. Wolford's log cabin had become unlivable. The heavy snow load on his peaked roof had bowed his main ridge beam, causing the chinking mortar in his northern corner joints to split wide open. Ice was forming on the inside face of his bedroom walls. Wolford walked through the white maelstrom of snow, his face covered in white frost, his beard frozen solid, and his eyes bloodshot with pure exhaustion. He did not bother knocking. He stood outside Samuel's southern wooden door for a long second, then pounded on the timber panels with all his remaining strength. Samuel pulled the door open. Wolford stood shivering on the threshold, clutching his coat collar tight around his throat. Wolford looked into the warm, golden light of the circular room and asked in a hoarse voice if Samuel had room for 6 more people. He admitted quietly that his own cabin had dropped down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit inside. His children were coughing heavily, and he could no longer fight the cold. Samuel stepped aside immediately, reached out, and pulled the Wolford family inside out of the blizzard. "Stay with me here," because what the Wolford family experienced over the next 3 days turned every established construction rule in the territory inside out. The Wolford family stayed inside Samuel's circular stone cabin for 72 hours. James Wolford spent most of those 3 days in stunned, absolute silence. He watched the central hearth burn a modest, low-burning fire of just 2 pine logs, while the air temperature inside the stone room sat at a steady, comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit from wall to wall. Wolford walked the perimeter of the room again and again. He pressed his bare palm flat against the interface of the river stone wall, feeling actual warmth radiating out from 24 inches of solid masonry that had been soaking up thermal energy for months. He examined the short radial roof rafters overhead. Despite the heavy snowstorm raging outside, there was not a single creak, not a single drop of water, and not a single sign of structural deflection. The conical roof was shedding snow automatically. Because the sloping cone allowed wind to slide around it, the wind swept the upper roof clean, leaving never more than 8 inches of snow accumulation near the wooden eaves. Meanwhile, Wolford's own peaked log cabin carried 3 full feet of wet, heavy ice that was threatening to cave his ceiling in. On his 3rd night beside the hearth, James Wolford sat on the stone bench and looked at Samuel. He said plainly that he needed to understand what was happening. He pointed out that Samuel's fire was half the size of his own. His wood consumption was barely a fraction of what everyone else was burning, yet it was over 20 degrees warmer inside the stone circle than his cabin had been all month. Samuel sat down beside him and walked him through the thermodynamic reality step by step. He explained how 24 inches of stone acted as a thermal storage battery. He showed him how the central fireplace radiated heat in 360 degrees, eliminating cold corners and draft currents. He explained how the round shape deflected wind pressure, preventing cold air from penetrating the structure. Here's the cold, hard truth. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't a lucky accident. It was simply a master stonemason, letting natural physical laws work for him instead of fighting against them with traditional human stubbornness. James Wolford was not a man who changed his mind easily. 30 years of timber carpentry had taught him to trust old ways and suspect new ideas. But 3 days inside a 62-degree room, while a 40-below blizzard raged outside, shattered his old beliefs completely. When the storm finally cleared enough for families to travel across the valley, Wolford made a formal request. He told Samuel that he wanted to measure the cabin properly with calibrated instruments, because if what he had felt inside that stone ring was mathematically real, every settler in Montana needed to know about it. On January 18, 1884, with the outdoor air temperature holding frozen at 14 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, James Wolford returned to the cabin alongside Martin Hayes. Hayes was the closest thing the valley had to a civil engineer. He was a retired surveyor who owned 2 precision mercury thermometers that had been calibrated against each other in a laboratory in St. Louis. He was known across the county for his uncompromising, methodical accuracy. The testing protocol was strict and scientific. Both cabins had been occupied and heated normally for the previous 24 hours. Both fireplaces had been fed at 6 in the morning with the exact same fuel load. 2 standard splits of dry lodgepole pine, weighing roughly 8 pounds each. Now, at 2 in the afternoon, with the outdoor temperature sitting at 14 below zero, Hayes began taking systematic temperature readings across both structures at 3 different height levels: floor level, chest height, and ceiling height. They started inside Wolford's traditional rectangular log cabin. Hayes moved methodically through the cold room, recording the mercury levels in his leather notebook. Near the corner fireplace, floor level read 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height read 58 degrees. Ceiling height read 64 degrees. At the center of the rectangular room, floor level dropped down to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height read 46 degrees. Ceiling height read 52 degrees. Then Hayes walked into the far corner of the cabin, opposite the fireplace, where the Wolford children had been sleeping before the storm hit. Floor level in the far corner read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Just 2 degrees above freezing. Chest height read 38 degrees. Ceiling height read 44 degrees. The data laid out a brutal reality. Heat in a square log cabin, stratified severely from floor to ceiling. The warm air sat uselessly at the ceiling peak, while the floor where human beings actually lived was dangerously cold. And the temperature degraded rapidly the further you walked from the fire, leaving the far corners sitting right on the edge of frostbite. Average overall interior temperature for Wolford's log cabin, 47 degrees Fahrenheit. They walked across the deep snow to Samuel's circular stone cabin. Hayes stepped inside, cleared his thermometer, and began taking the exact same set of readings. Near the central stone hearth, floor level read 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height read 68 degrees. Ceiling height read 69 degrees. At mid-radius, 9 feet outward from the central fire, floor level read 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height read 67 degrees. Ceiling height read 68 degrees. Along the outer perimeter stone wall, floor level read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height read 65 degrees. Ceiling height read 67 degrees. Martin Hayes stared at the mercury column in his glass thermometer. He tapped the brass casing, looked at his notebook, and then rechecked the floor, reading at 3 separate points along the outer curved wall. The mercury did not budge. Hayes looked up at Samuel and said quietly that the numbers did not make sense, according to conventional builder logic. Samuel asked him why. Hayes answered that the temperature variation across the entire circular cabin was practically zero. There was only a 3-degree difference from the central hearth all the way out to the exterior stone wall, and barely a 2-degree difference from the floor to the ceiling rafters. In Wolford's cabin, they had measured a massive 30-degree temperature swing depending on where a person stood in the room. Inside Samuel's stone circle, the thermal environment was completely uniform. Let that sink in for a second. The average interior temperature inside Samuel's round stone cabin measured 66 degrees Fahrenheit. That was 19 degrees warmer than Wolford's traditional log home. But the most crushing number, the metric that echoed across the Montana Territory for decades, was the comparison between the coldest spots in both houses. In Wolford's square cabin, the far corner floor sat at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. In Samuel's round cabin, the outer stone wall floor sat at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That was a staggering 28-degree difference at the coldest point of the house. Rounded to 30 degrees in local tavern conversations, it was a metric that no traditional builder could argue with, ignore, or explain away. And Hayes was not done. He tracked both cabins' wood consumption for another 7 consecutive days. Wolford's log cabin consumed 18 hundredths of a cord of wood per day, burning roughly 115 pounds of pine timber every 24 hours just to maintain an average interior chill of 47 degrees. Samuel's round stone cabin consumed 9 hundredths of a cord per day, burning barely 58 pounds of wood to maintain a comfortable 66 degrees. Samuel was burning less than half the firewood to keep his family 19 degrees warmer overall, and nearly 30 degrees warmer along the outer walls. The scientific measurement swept through the settlement like a lightning strike. The mockery vanished overnight. The laughter stopped completely. By late January, settlers began arriving at Samuel's property every single day. They didn't come to mock anymore. They came to measure, to study, and to learn. The cultural shift across Flathead County was swift and permanent. James Wolford was among the very first to adapt. In March of 1884, as soon as the frozen ground thawed enough to strike a pick, he began constructing a curved stone addition to his square log house. He didn't tear down his original home, but he wrapped a half-circle stone wing with 18-inch masonry around the western side, installing a small central hearth. By the following winter, that curved stone addition became his family's primary living space from November through March. Others followed quickly. Benjamin Porter tore down his failing timber shelter and built a round stone cabin almost identical to Samuel's, making it slightly larger at 22 feet in diameter. The Fletcher family built an oval stone house, blending the curved envelope with their need for an attached workspace. By the winter of 1885, 17 separate structures within a 50-mile radius had incorporated circular or curved stone walls, central heating flues, and heavy thermal storage mass. Samuel never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. When settlers called him a genius, he would simply shake his head and point out that he had merely borrowed ideas from what he had seen throughout his life. Scottish roundhouses, Native American typists and hogans, and old stone lime kilns in Aberdeen. He would tell people that he just paid attention to what worked in nature, stopped fighting natural forces, and built accordingly. The round stone cabin stood firm for 47 years. Samuel and Catherine raised their daughters there, watching them grow up and bring grandchildren back to visit the warm stone room. The building required almost zero maintenance. Stone does not rot, warp, or split the way timber logs do. The shingle roof needed fresh cedar shakes every decade, but the wall footings remained rock solid year after year. In 1931, when Samuel reached 76 years of age and Catherine had passed away, he finally moved into town to live with his daughter. The cabin stood vacant for a few years until another young homesteading family purchased the property, living in the legendary warm shelter until 1957. The roof eventually collapsed in the late 1960s, not from structural failure or snow load, but from simple human neglect after decades of abandonment. But the circular foundation remained, a perfect ring of river stone embedded deep in the Montana earth. Archaeologists from the University of Montana documented the physical site in 1983, exactly 100 years after Samuel first scored his circular outline in the dirt. Their formal survey report noted the remarkably sophisticated understanding of passive thermal dynamics and aerodynamic geometry evident in the ruins. The true legacy of Samuel Hendricks was not the physical rocks he stacked. It was the principle he proved. The idea that sometimes the wisdom we dismiss as strange or foolish is simply wisdom we haven't tested yet. That tradition deserves respect, but never blind obedience. And that the best solutions come from paying attention to how physical laws actually work, rather than how we think they ought to work. Winter proved him right, the numbers proved him right, and 17 homesteading families proved him right by rebuilding their world to capture the warmth of the circle. That wasn't magic. That was just paying attention. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while the technical building concepts, thermal dynamics, and physical principles discussed are based on verified historical practices and well-established engineering knowledge. Any modern building project should be evaluated according to current building codes and safety standards. This content is purely educational and does not constitute professional architecture or engineering advice.